Cause you had a bad day, you take it one down, you sing a sad song just to turn it around. You say you don't know, you tell me don't lie, you're working a smile and you go for a ride. You had a bad day, the camera don't lie, you calm it back down and you really don't mind. You had a bad day, you had a bad day. Well, you need a blue sky all the day. The point is they laugh at what you say, and I don't need no care to know. You had a bad day, you take it one down, you sing a sad song just to turn it around. You say you don't know, you tell me don't lie, you work at a smile and you go for a ride. You had a bad day, the camera don't lie, you calm it back down and you really don't mind. You had a bad day.
Doesn't that slow motion one with the dog just get you? He jumps up for the knot, misses it, and his eyes are just like, no. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Mike King, and I'm the senior pastor here at Suburban. And this morning, we're continuing on in a sermon series that we're calling Epic Fail. And it turns out that epic failures, right, these mistakes and screw-ups that we make, they're not just limited to people. Animals do them too, which is part of the reason why we wanted to show that video as we got started. Partly because of that, and partly because that's really about the only funny thing in the sermon this morning. You know, I mentioned last week that this series, Epic Fail, is a study of the Old Testament book of Judges, and there's just not a lot that is funny in that book. If you missed last week for any reason, I would encourage you to go back and maybe listen to or watch that sermon online, because it gives you an overview of the book as a whole. But that book is really a history of the people of Israel at a time when things were not going well. Basically, the people of Israel just kind of made one mistake after another, one epic failure after another, and God continually had to show up and kind of bail them out. So we're going to go back to that book today, so I'd encourage you to turn with me in your Bibles to Judges chapter 10. You can use whatever format of Bible you brought. If it would help you for any reason, there are some red Bibles in the seat in front of you, and you can grab one of those and turn to the page number on the screen just so that you can kind of track along with us. But as I mentioned last week, the book of Judges is actually set up, the way that it's structured is it's sort of set up based on this cycle. There's a cycle of repeated actions and behavior that you see over and over again as you go through the book of Judges. And what I thought I would do is just read for you the very first story of a judge. And remember, judges in this book are not like courtroom judges like we think of them. They're military leaders that God would sort of raise up for a certain time to sort of help deliver his people. And the first judge that they talked about, his story is really short. So I figured I would just read it to you out of chapter 3 so you could kind of see this pattern play out. So his name is Othniel, and it starts out and it says this. It says, "The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God, and they served the Baals and the Asherahs." Those are other gods of other religions. "So the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, so that he sold them into the hands of Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Aram, whom the Israelites were subject to for 8 years. But when they cried out to the Lord, he raised up for them a deliverer, Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, who saved them. It says, the Spirit of the Lord came on him." And remember that line, we'll come back to it. The Spirit of the Lord came on him, so that he became Israel's judge and went to war. The Lord gave Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Aram, into the hands of Othniel, who overpowered him. So the land had peace for 40 years, until Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. So that's kind of this cycle. That's sort of one example, kind of the perfect judge story there. And in it, you see this cycle. We showed you this image last week, but it's this pattern of behavior you see over and over in the book of Judges. It always happens this way. So it starts out that, things are going well or things are kind of peaceful. And during that time where things are going well, the people of Israel turn their back on God. They sort of depart from his ways for living and behaving, and they sin and they kind of go their own way. And as a result of that, God doesn't want his people to stay far from him. So he allows these foreign armies to come in and take over and kind of oppress the people in the land. Right? In Othniel's story, that happened for 8 years. And then the people don't like being oppressed, so they cry out. And God, because he loves his people, sort of taps someone on the shoulder and sort of raises them up as a judge, a military leader to kind of rally the troops. His Spirit is on him, and his Spirit empowers him to go and kind of drive the bad guys out of the land. And then the people enjoy peace again. But as we saw last week, it never lasts. Because when you get back to peace, you're back up at the top of the cycle. And after a period of peace, the people forget God, turn their back on God, go their own way, and the whole cycle starts again. But as we mentioned, it's not just a cycle like this. It's really more of a downward spiral. Because as you go through the book, every time you go around the corner and start that cycle again, the sort of behavior that the Israelites do to each other, the things they do to each other get worse and worse. And the judges that God sort of calls up to help them, they get kind of more and more broken and flawed. And sort of the deliverance and the relief that they're able to offer becomes more and more incomplete each time. And so it's really this sort of terrible negative spiral. You get down to the bottom, and then the end of the book is just incredibly depressing when you see what the people are doing to each other. But this is the first one, Othniel, right? And Othniel, if you guys were here last week, you actually met him very briefly. See, Othniel shows up in the first chapter of Judges. He's mentioned just in one verse, but he's mentioned as somebody who kind of does the right thing. He follows God wholeheartedly. He's kind of a man after God's own heart. So in that sense, you think, well, of course, he's the perfect guy to tap on the shoulder to be the first judge to deliver Israel. Othniel is like the star pupil, Eagle Scout kind of class president guy. He's the one that's the really most obvious, likely candidate to kind of get the job done. And since there's patterns all through the book of Judges, and this is the first one, God kind of taps the likely guy on the shoulder, you wonder, well, is this pattern going to take place all through the book? Are all of the judges going to follow this pattern? Well, it turns out they don't. So what I want to do now is jump in and look at the story of another judge in chapter 10. We'll kind of see how he differs from this model. So starting in verse 6 of chapter 10, we read, and the cycle is kind of starting itself over. It says, again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They served the Baals and the Ashtoreths. They served the gods of Aram and the gods of Sidon and the gods of Moab and the gods of the Ammonites and the gods of the Philistines, right? Basically, they served every god except their God. And because the Israelites forsook the Lord and no longer served them, he became angry with them. And he sold them into the hands of the Philistines and the Ammonites, who that year shattered and crushed them. For 18 years, they oppressed all of the Israelites on the east side of the Jordan in Gilead to the land of the Amorites. And Israel was in great distress. Then the Israelites cried out to the Lord. Right, so you see that same cycle starting up, right? They kind of forget God, they go their own way, they sin. God sort of has enough of it, and he allows these other armies to come in and oppress them with the idea that that will bring them back. And this is no common, everyday, ordinary oppression. I mean, look at the language. It says the people were shattered. They were crushed, and it went on for 18 years until finally God kind of calls out, or the people call out to God. And God responds by picking a judge to deliver them. But it's important to note, God doesn't respond because the Israelites get their act together or because they're just really good people. No, as you read on in the text, it says God responds because he could bear Israel's misery no longer. Right? He acts because of his love, because of his mercy, his compassion for the people. He doesn't want to see them suffer anymore. That's what motivates his decision to sort of tap this man Jephthah on the shoulder, make him a judge who will deliver the people. So at the beginning verses of chapter 11, we meet this guy Jephthah. So we'll kind of see how he fits or doesn't fit with that pattern. So Jephthah the Gileadite was a mighty warrior. His father was Gilead, his mother was a prostitute. Gilead's wife also bore him sons, and when they were grown up, they drove Jephthah away. You're not going to get any inheritance in our family, they said, because you're the son of another woman. So Jephthah fled from his brothers and settled in the land of Tob, where a gang of scoundrels gathered around him and followed him. Okay, so if Othniel is like the Eagle Scout ideal candidate to be a judge, Jephthah is like the kid who's going to juvenile hall, right? I mean, he's got nothing in his background that recommends him. He comes from an incredibly dysfunctional family, right? His mom was a prostitute, and I guess his dad kind of let him live at the house until his wife had some other kids. And when those kids grew up, they didn't want this other guy in there. So they drive him out, and he ends up kind of being the head of this criminal gang out in the wilderness. So he's a pretty flawed guy. He's not the judge that you would expect. And his flaws end up really having some devastating consequences, as we'll see in a minute. But the people of Israel realize God has tapped him on the shoulder. So the leaders come and they say, come, be our commander so that we can fight the Ammonites. And Jephthah agrees to do that, but he kind of has some back and forth with them. He says, you guys, people of Israel have not always been good to me. You've kicked me out once. Can you give me a guarantee that you'll actually let me lead? So in verse 10, it says that the elders say, they make this pledge, the Lord is our witness. We will certainly do as you say. Whatever you say to do, Jephthah, we'll do it. You lead the charge. So Jephthah takes charge of the army, And there's kind of a long passage where he tries to negotiate with the opposing king. Negotiations don't go anywhere, so he's ready to fight. And we read this. It says, "Then the Spirit of the Lord came on Jephthah." Right? There's that phrase again, the Spirit of the Lord. We saw that with Othniel. The Spirit of the Lord came on Jephthah, and he crossed Gilead and Manasseh, passed through Mizpah of Gilead, and from there he advanced against the Ammonites. So at this point, the battle is actually already won. Because up until this point in the book of Judges, whenever the Spirit of the Lord shows up, victory is assured, right? Because it's the Spirit of the Lord. It's actually God's power working through the judges, working through the people that makes this deliverance happen. They're not pulling it off on their own. You saw that with Othniel. It's almost in a sense the way that, the way that World War II historians talk about D-Day. Right, in D-Day, when you think about what those incredibly brave soldiers did when they took to the Omaha beach and they established this beachhead, right, what historians say is that at that point, once that beachhead was established, the fate of the war had been decided. Now, there were still battles to fight, there were still years to go, but once that the Allies created a way to get people and supplies onto the continent, to really project their military power there was no way that the Axis powers were going to win. Once that had happened, the writing was on the wall, the end was written out, even though there were still things that had to happen to get there. And that's where we are in this battle too with Jephthah, right? When the Spirit of the Lord shows up, it's kind of like D-Day, that the battle is assured, the victory is assured. They've still got to go out and actually fight and do it, but the outcome is in the bag. The only problem, though, is that Jephthah doesn't seem to know enough about God to understand that. So picture this scene, right? Jephthah's getting ready to go out and lead the army out into battle. He's probably nervous. He wants this to go well. And so he's trying to figure out what he can do to kind of gain a little bit of a competitive advantage. So he decides that he is going to make this vow to God. So look what he says. "And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord. He said, 'If you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering.'" Right, so Jephthah's saying, if God gives me the victory, and now we know that he's going to give him the victory, and Jephthah, if he knew God at all, should know that the victory was assured because God's Spirit was there on him. But instead he makes this bargain. He says, "God, if you'll just help me win, whatever walks out of the door of my house, I'll sacrifice it to you, it'll be yours," right? He's trying to sort of get God's favor. So he makes this deal, and then he goes on out, and again, as expected, they end up winning. It says, "Then Jephthah went over to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gave them into his hands. He devastated 20 towns from Aroer in the vicinity of Minnith as far as Abel-keramim. Thus Israel subdued Ammon." Right? It's really a great victory for the people of Israel. But unfortunately, it's not the end of the story. The story takes a really tragic turn. So you keep reading, and it says this. "When Jephthah returned home," and remember the vow he made, "when Jephthah returned to his home in Mizpah, who should come out to meet him but his daughter?" Right, dancing to the sound of timbrels, right? She wants to celebrate with her daddy because she's heard he's won this victory, so she marches out the door to welcome him home and cheer him in. She was an only child. Except for her, he had neither son nor daughter. And when he saw her, he tore his clothes and cried, "Oh no, my daughter, you have brought me down, and I am devastated. I have made a vow to the Lord that I cannot break." Now, we need to stop and hit pause for just a minute here, because over the years, people have struggled with this story and struggled to make sense of it, and rightly so, right? It is a horrible story. It's a story about this dad who essentially is going to murder his daughter. He's going to sacrifice his daughter to kind of buy God's favor in this battle. And over the years, people have really struggled with this text because they look at it and they think, well, Jephthah was a judge and, he delivered the people. And, well, surely he didn't mean that. Like, they're trying to figure out some way to square up the good thing that he did with this awful thing that he did. And if you read what people have said about this over the years, it is amazing. They do some mental gymnastics like you will not believe to try to figure out some way to argue that, well, he didn't really mean for this to happen. This wasn't exactly what was going on. And one of the arguments that you see a lot is this. They say, oh, you know what, Jephthah didn't mean a person. He clearly had an animal in mind. He was going to sacrifice an animal. Animal sacrifices were real common at the time. That's what he had in mind. But oh, the unfortunate thing is that his daughter came out first, so he had to sacrifice her. But you hear that argument a lot, but it doesn't hold a lot of water for a couple of reasons. The first of which is that in the original language in the Hebrew, that phrase that he uses, whoever comes out to meet me, that phrase really applies more to people than it does to animals. And the other one's just kind of common sense, right? If Jephthah had an animal in mind, Put yourself in his shoes. What would you have done, right? You walk up to the door, and you're coming home, and your daughter walks out, and you're like, sweetie, it's great to see you. Come over here, and let's wait together and watch and see which animal comes out first, because then we're going to gut it and kill it and give it to God. Right? But he doesn't say that. He doesn't say that because he clearly has in mind the fact that he is going to sacrifice a human life in order to buy God's help in this battle. Now, he didn't mean it to be his daughter, right? My guess is that he thought it was going to be a servant or somebody that was a lot more expendable in his view. I mean, typically in that day when the master is coming home, it's the servant who would come out first to greet him and take their stuff and see if they need anything. And that, I think, is what explains sort of the shock and the sorrow that he feels when it's his daughter who's come out to do this. But we can't whitewash it. We can't say, no, he meant it to be something else. Like, there's just no way around the fact, in my mind at least, that he intended to take a human life in order to try and buy God's favor. So there's no need to do mental gymnastics to try to make him a role model, because that is actually the point of this story. Jephthah is not a role model, right? We're not supposed to imitate him. Not every story in the Bible is there because we're supposed to imitate what it does. In fact, one of the things that I think this story shows us is that just because God uses someone, just because God's working in a powerful way in one area of a person's life, it doesn't mean that God's stamp of approval is on absolutely everything else that person does. The same thing is true for us, right? Just because God maybe works through us doesn't mean that God is, in one area, means that he's just 100% on board with everything we do all the time in every area. And just this idea, right, that just because somebody's doing something good doesn't mean they're perfect in every area. We just know that from our own experience to be true, right? We all read stories about pastors who have these sort of thriving churches, but, they're off sleeping with the secretary on the side, or there's something wrong behind the scenes. Or think about your own life. Maybe there's someone who's been a mentor to you. Maybe it was kind of your first job in business. Someone really trained you and invested in you. And really, you are where you are today. And you are who you are today because of how this person invested in your life. But then you find out that they were stealing from the company. Or you find out that things at home weren't exactly what you thought they were going to be. Right? We all know examples of that. Some of us have experienced being on the other side of that. But just because a person is broken in one area doesn't mean that the good that they invested in your life doesn't count. It doesn't matter. I mean, what this story reminds us of is that we're complicated, right? All of us are broken in some ways. And we do good on some days and poor on some days, good in some areas, we're broken in some areas. But we just can't fall into the trap of thinking just because we see the good that someone's doing or the way that God is using someone in this area, it means we've got to be 100% on board with everything else they do and assume that God is just kind of giving it all a thumbs up. Because that's just not how it works. Right? This side of heaven, we all have brokenness that we have to deal with. And you see that in Jephthah's life story. Jephthah tried to use a human sacrifice to buy God's favor. And unfortunately for him, and really unfortunately for his daughter, she's the one who walks out the door. So he sees that, and he's heartbroken. And he gives her a couple of months to sort of grieve and put her affairs in order. And then you read the text, and it says this. It says, she returned to her father, and he did to her as he had vowed. So what do we do with this, right? What do we do with a story like this in the Bible? I mean, really, why did Jephthah do it? What does the fact that he murders his own daughter tell us about God or tell us about him? I mean, honestly, I think it tells us a lot more about him than it tells us about God. And one of the things I think it shows us about him is that he was just much more influenced by the culture around him than he was by the teaching and the wisdom of God that was revealed in Scripture. But you've got to remember, Jephthah was just completely numbed to the violence of the culture around him. The time in which he lived was an incredibly violent time. And all these other sort of people groups and other religious traditions that were among them and around them, for some of those groups, human sacrifice was part of the deal. It was not an uncommon thing to see that. And I think the fact that Jephthah's mind goes here, I mean, think about it. He's in this moment of tension, right? He's going out, he wants to win the fight, and he knows he needs to do something. And it's in moments like that, when the rubber meets the road, when you make a split-second decision, that what is inside shows up, right? I mean, just think about it. I feel like I'm a pretty patient person until I get cut off in traffic. And then the words that I say are not patient, right? Some of you know that, right? It's in those moments when we've got to make a split-second decision. We don't have time to think through things. We just do what we know and what comes naturally. And the fact that at this moment, Jephthah's instinct was to say, how do I encourage God to be on my side? I know. I'll promise to kill someone and give him that person as a sacrifice. just shows us that he'd been kind of drinking the water of the culture around him. I mean, really, it's kind of a horrifying example of the fact that sometimes, more than any of us would like to admit, the culture has pretty big impact on us. And we've got to be aware of that and fight against that. The Apostle Paul, who was an early Christian leader, wrote a letter to believers in the city of Rome, and he talked about that. He said this. He said, "Do not be conformed to this world, but instead you need to be transformed by the renewing of your mind." Right? And there's a wonderful paraphrase by a guy named J.B. Phillips. I love the way he paraphrases this verse. He says, "Don't let the world squeeze you into its mold." Right? Because that's what's happened here. In this particular area, Jephthah has gotten squeezed into the mold of the world when it comes to how do you relate to God? How do you engage and ask him for things? And again, he's got some stuff right. I mean, he knows that God is powerful. He knows God can help his people. He knows God would like to help his people. But it's just in this area of how do you invite him to do that? How do you assure that he will do that he's missing the mark? And Jephthah had access to the wisdom of God. Right, Jephthah, I'm sure, knew the teaching of God, right? You look in the book of Deuteronomy, which is something he would have had access to. God makes it really clear how he feels about human sacrifice. In there he says this, he's talking about how you shouldn't worship the way that other religions around them do. He says, "You must not worship the Lord your God in their way, because in worshiping their gods, they do all kinds of detestable things the Lord hates. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire as sacrifices to their gods." Right, Jephthah knew that. But when it comes to sort of how do you invite God to be on your side, to invite him to show up, he is squeezed into the mold of the world around him. And here's the thing. We've got to be aware of that too, because that happens to us. We get squeezed into the world's mold as well. Now, the society that we live in, it doesn't really put a high value on sacrificing human life in order to sort of earn God's approval. So that's part of the story. It just really appalls us because that's not something that we would do. That's not the particular mold that our world is trying to squeeze us into. Now, I think for us, there are a lot of other trouble areas. We're a lot more likely to get squeezed into the world's mold when it comes to how we relate to or how we deal with money, or what we do with our sexuality, or what we do in terms of reaching out to other people, or how we view our individual rights, right? Those are kind of the molds where we're probably more at risk of being squeezed into what the world says. And I think one of the lessons that we pull from this story is that that's just how we're wired. Right? We all have blind spots. We are all blind to the different ways that our culture impacts the way we think and how we make decisions and how we speak and how we act. We're much more impacted by that than we want to admit or that we sometimes realize. So what do we do about that? I mean, kind of by definition, we're not aware of them. That's what blind spots mean. We don't see that they're there. So we've just got to realize that we probably have these. And we have to be open to sort of doing some self-examination and trying to figure out where might these spots be. And we have to find ways to identify people that we trust and let them speak into our lives to help us see these things, because sometimes we're just not going to see them ourselves. We need people who will say, "Hey, this is the set of values that you said you wanted to live by. And as I look at your life and your decisions, it seems like you're veering away from the commitments that you've made. How can I help you come back? What does that look like?" So that's a question I think we all need to wrestle with. Who do you have in your life who can call you out on your junk? Right? Who do you have in your life who can have that kind of conversation with you, with your good in mind, to help pull you back to live out the values that you're committed to living out? Maybe it's a friend. Maybe it's a spouse. Or maybe you don't have that kind of person in your life yet. You need to think, how do I deepen an existing relationship to help it move in that direction? Or how do I find somebody who can do that for me? Because we need that, right? We all have these blind spots, and if we're not aware of them, if we're not sort of working against them, there's a chance that we're going to go down a similar road to what Jephthah went down. So that's one of the lessons that I think we can pull from this. And the other one is hard to talk about as well, but to me, the best way to get into it is to ask a question. And that question is this. This is something that as a parent I struggle with, right? We've got 4 kids. I got 3 daughters, right? So when he talks about sacrificing his daughter, that means something to me. But to me, I just wonder, why did he go through with it? I mean, think about it. If you were in his shoes, right? If you had made this rash vow and you walk out to your house and your only child walks out, what would you do? I'm guessing you would do what I would do. You would say, "God, I'm going to fall to my knees and say, I'm sorry. This was a really stupid vow to make. I'm sorry, but I'm not going to go through with this. Clearly, this is not something that you want me to do. Like, I just ask your forgiveness for not following through with the vow. I ask you forgiveness for making the stupid thing in the first place." But the crazy thing is It never even occurs to him to do that. Even though he knows that human sacrifice is something that God expressly said that he does not want, it never occurs to him to say there may be a way to back out of this. And again, I think that's because in part he's just so locked in to the view of God that he has picked up from the culture around him, which says that God is really powerful, but God is really vindictive. So if you make a promise to him and you don't come through on that, you better watch yourself because he will get you. And if you think about that, really, I think the struggle that Jephthah has is he just cannot trust that the God that he worships is loving and is gracious and is forgiving. He just doesn't see those things as being part of the character of the God that he's following. So for him, right, when he's made this commitment, and he's like, okay, I've made this commitment, but I see that it's going to be disastrous, he doesn't see that there's a way out of it. I mean, maybe for him, he thinks, well, if I try to back out of this, God may kill my daughter and me and the whole village anyway. But it really comes from this sort of fearful view of God. Right? He knows that God is powerful, but he's just terrified that he's also angry and vindictive. Right? That is the only thing as a father that I can think of that would push this man to go against every instinct, every cry of his heart, and actually kill his child. So here's a kind of an uncomfortable question to sort of bring this to a close. Where do we see ourselves in this story? Now, if you're like me, you don't want to see yourself anywhere in this story, right? This story is a train wreck, and you're like, I don't want to have any part of this. But if we're honest, like, we see ourselves in different pieces of this story. I mean, maybe you're here today, and you really do struggle with seeing God as being loving and gracious and forgiving. You just don't think that's part of his character. Maybe that's kind of how you see yourself in this story. Or maybe you're here today and you don't believe in God at all. You're not interested in any of this. You actually only came because Grandma said you wouldn't get to go to lunch with her unless you went with her to church. And if that's the case, I apologize for Grandma. We are all works in progress and need help. But yeah, for you, maybe you really have some suspicions and questions about religion, and you say, this is why. This is why. It's examples like this. It shows the damage that religion can do in people's lives. I don't want anything to do with this. Or maybe you've been exploring faith for a while, but you just kind of can't make that jump and invite God to be the Lord and leader of your life because you just kind of can't square the picture that you see of God, who's sometimes angry. And what do you do with that? With these words like love and justice and mercy and forgiveness. Well, if you're here this morning and you're in any one of those camps, I really hope that one of the things that you take away from this time is that you might be open to the possibility of just seeing God differently. Because Jephthah really misunderstands who God is. That's the tragedy of this story. He only understands about half of the gospel message. Right? The gospel, as simply as I know how to put it, is that we are all more broken than we can ever know. But we're also more loved by God than we can ever imagine. Jephthah got the broken part, right? He knew that we're all more broken than we can ever know, but he just couldn't take that leap. He couldn't fit it into his mental picture of God to realize that he is more loved than he could ever imagine. And that God's love and grace and mercy and forgiveness are always there for him, even when we make mistakes. Yeah, and that's something that, if you're in that camp and you've wondered about that, here's what I want to invite you to do today as we bring this to a close. I'm going to put a question up on the screen, and I just want to encourage you to think about it. So here's the question. What would we do differently if we really believed, if we really, truly believed that God loved us and that he was committed to work out the best for us? How would that change the way that you picture God? Or that might be new. Maybe that doesn't fit into your definition of God. It doesn't fit with your experience or what you've seen some of the people who follow him do. Right? How would that change the way you interact with him? How would that change the way that you even think about how you could enter into a relationship with God, right? Because we don't earn our way into a relationship with God by giving a lot or sacrificing a lot or making these sort of elaborate, sacrifices to him. Instead, we just recognize that we're broken. We can't fix ourselves, but he loves us too much to let it stay that way. So he offers us love and grace and forgiveness. And we simply accept that and invite him to be the Lord and leader of our life. So if that's where you are, if you're in one of those camps, I just want to encourage you to chew on this question today. And if you get to the point today or sometime where you think what I ended up thinking years ago, if this is really true, this could really change my life. I want to know more about this. Then as you leave today, I just would encourage you. We've got some people in our prayer room. You kind of go out that door and take a right that would just love to hear what's going on. Just have a conversation with you about what you're thinking, and then just pray for you in any way that you would like them to. But for the others of us, maybe when we're here today, God's kind of put something else in your mind and in your heart. It's one of these other things we've talked about, the idea that God uses broken people. right? The idea that we've got to be careful or the world can squeeze us into its mold. Or maybe for you, what you're thinking, you're a follower of Jesus. You've been following him for a long time. You understand he's loving and gracious and forgiving, but there's an area or two in your life where you just kind of keep screwing up and you keep messing up and you think, I know he's forgiving, but he's had to forgive me on that one over and over and over again. I wonder if I'm starting to scrape the bottom of the barrel in terms of his grace and forgiveness. But if that's where you are, if you're in any of those camps, or if you're thinking about something else that God's leading you to think about, I just want to encourage you to wrestle with this very same question. Right? What difference would it make? What would we do differently if we really believed that God loved us and was committed to work out the best for us? Because a God who really does love us, that's who we worship. I mean, that's who we're talking about today. That's who the book of Judges points us towards. Every epic failure in that book just reminds us that we can't fix this on our own, but it points us towards the one who can. You think about the most famous verse in the Bible, right? John 3:16, it talks about how God loved the world so much that he gave his son so that everyone who believes in him could be saved. And he goes on in the very next verse to say this. He reminds us that God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. And friends, that's the God that we're talking about this morning. That's the God who is here and present and would love nothing more than to speak words of life and hope and encouragement to you today. So I would encourage you to keep in mind that that is the God that we talk to when we pray, and would invite you to pray with me. So God, thank you for the opportunity that we have to be here together today. I think I'm thankful for the book of Judges and for the story of Jephthah, as terrible and as awful as it is. And every time I read it, it just kind of makes me want to throw up. But God, we're grateful for the fact that even in these stories, we see things that point us to you and to the love and the mercy and the hope that you have for us. So God, I just pray that you would do what you alone can do. I want to ask you to do the impossible today since you specialize in that. I just want you to speak to the mind and the heart of each person who's here and help them really come up with an answer to that question. As they look at their lives and where they are, what would they do differently if they really believe that you are loving and gracious? And then God, when you've helped them answer that question, I just pray that you would give them some really simple steps that they can do to put that into practice today. And we trust, Lord, that through the power of your Holy Spirit that raised Jesus Christ from the dead, you can do this in us and for us. So we ask that you would come through on that promise in a way that amazes us. Amen.